trash like you doesn't belong in first class. Get up, get your things, and go back to economy where you came from, before I make you." The words landed like a second slap, before the first one ever happened, cutting through the soft hum of the first-class cabin with a clarity that made every nearby passenger go absolutely still, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace but from shock, the kind that happens when something is said out loud that everyone knows should never be said at all. Caleb James didn't move. He was 17 years old, and he had learned a long time ago that stillness was sometimes the only dignified response available to him, that keeping his hands folded and his eyes forward and his breathing even was a form of armor that cost him everything to maintain and everything not to. He stared at the seat back in front of him, and he did not respond, and for a moment the woman beside him seemed to mistake his silence for submission. That was when her hand moved. It happened faster than anyone in the cabin could process a sharp sideways swing across the narrow space between seat 4A and seat 4B. The flat of Diana Sloane's palm connecting with the left side of Caleb's face, with a sound that cracked through the pressurized air of the cabin like something structural giving way, like a sound that didn't belong at 30,000 feet, like a sound that once heard could not be unheard. Caleb's head snapped to the right. His worn composition notebook slid from his lap and fell to the floor between his feet. His hand went instinctively to his cheek, and the red warmth spreading beneath his palm was real, and the tears that threatened at the corners of his eyes were real, and the 60-something passengers in the rows around him, who had gone completely, utterly silent, were real, and none of them moved. In row 5, a man lowered his drink without drinking from it. In row 3, a woman in a gray blazer removed her reading glasses and set them deliberately on her tray table. At the back of the first-class cabin, a flight attendant named Brooke stood frozen mid-step with a tray of drinks balanced in her hands, her face cycling through emotions she hadn't been trained to manage. And somewhere above all of them, separated by a reinforced door and the thin wall of the cockpit, an intercom light blinked on. Here is what no one on American Airlines Flight 417 from Chicago to Washington, D.C. understood in that moment, what no one could have understood from the outside, looking in at a teenage boy holding his cheek in a first-class seat, while a platinum-haired woman in a designer jacket sat rigid beside him with the residue of certainty still on her face. They did not understand who that boy was, where he was going, or what was sitting in the worn notebook that had just fallen to the floor. They did not know about the 11,000 books, or the church basement in Englewood, or the Senate hearing scheduled for the following morning, or the $400 million bill currently sitting untouched in committee, waiting for someone to make the case for why it mattered. They did not know about Dr. Yvonne Reed, seated in economy 30 rows back, who had spent the last 2 years preparing this boy for exactly that moment. Not the slap, not the humiliation, not 30,000 feet above the earth with his face burning and his notes on the floor, but the other moment, the one in the marble chamber with the cameras and the senators and the weight of 10,000 underfunded school libraries pressing against the back of his throat as he opened his notebook and began to speak. They did not know about Nora Haynes in seat 3. The woman who had just set her reading glasses on her tray table with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided something. A retired federal judge, 22 years on the bench. A woman who had presided over some of the most consequential civil rights cases in the history of her circuit, and who knew from long experience exactly what deliberate cruelty looked like, and exactly what it cost everyone in the room when the person with authority chose to look away. And they did not know about Captain James Whitfield Jim to everyone who had flown with him across his 27 years in commercial aviation. A silver-haired, quietly methodical man who had landed planes in zero visibility, who had talked passengers through medical emergencies over the intercom, who had made 1,000 small decisions in his career that never made the news because good decisions rarely do. What they knew was what they could see, a black teenager in first class, a white woman who had just hit him, and a cabin full of people who had watched it happen and had not yet decided what to do about it. That decision was about to be made for them. Before we go any further into this story, we want to ask, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because this community reaches further than we ever imagined, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe that what happened on this flight matters, that a pilot's decision to do the right thing deserves to be seen by as many people as possible, please take a second right now to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every story we share is built around moments that demand to be witnessed, and your support is what makes it possible to keep telling them. Hit that subscribe button, hit like, and let's get back to Flight 417, because what happens next inside that cabin is something nobody on that plane or watching this video will ever forget. Diana Sloan, 44, had boarded this flight the way she boarded every flight, with the settled confidence of someone who had long since decided that the world was arranged correctly and that her place within it was earned and fixed. Caleb James, 17, had boarded it with a composition notebook, a carry-on bag with a broken zipper, and a boarding pass for a first-class seat that still felt like a mistake, even though it wasn't. 3 hours before Diana Sloan's hand crossed the distance between Seat 4A and Seat 4B, Chicago O'Hare Airport was doing what it always did in the early morning hours, grinding forward with the particular exhausted efficiency of a place that never fully stops the terminals filling slowly with travelers dragging luggage and balancing coffee cups and staring at departure boards with the slightly glazed expressions of people who have done this too many times to be surprised by any of it. Caleb James moved through the terminal differently. He was not glazed. He was acutely, almost painfully aware of everything: the squeak of his sneakers on the polished floor, the weight of his backpack against his shoulders, the way his hands kept drifting to the zipper of his bag to check for the 4th or 5th time that the composition notebook was still there. The notebook held his testimony. 41 pages of handwritten notes, statistics and stories that he had been refining for the better part of 6 months, each page covered in his cramped, careful handwriting with margin notes and crossed-out sentences and small stars drawn next to the lines he most wanted to remember. He was going to Washington, D.C. to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Education Equity. He was going to sit at a long wooden table in a marble chamber and tell United States senators with cameras rolling and a court reporter typing about what it meant to grow up in Englewood on the south side of Chicago, about what it meant to attend a school with a library that had 200 books for 400 students, about what happened to a child's sense of possibility when the shelves around them are empty. He was 17 years old. He had been told by Dr. Yvonne Reed, his mentor and the faculty advisor to his nonprofit organization, Page by Page, that he was the youngest person ever formally invited to testify before this particular subcommittee. He had written that fact down in the margin of his notebook and then crossed it out because he didn't want to lead with it. He didn't want the senators thinking about his age when he needed them, thinking about the books. Dr. Reed walked beside him through the terminal, a tall woman in her mid-40s with natural hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she kept forgetting. Were there a professor of education policy at Howard University who spoke in full, perfectly constructed sentences even when she was tired, which she was now. She had her own carry-on, her own folders, her own carefully organized materials for the day after the hearing when she would meet separately with the subcommittee's research staff. She had made this trip to D.C. Many times in her career had sat across from legislators and policy directors and foundation officers and made careful evidence-based arguments for things that should not have required arguments at all. She was good at it. She was patient in the way that people become patient when they have been fighting the same battles for long enough to understand that patience is not the same thing as acceptance. The flight was boarding at gate H14. They arrived with 20 minutes to spare, and Caleb found an empty seat near an outlet to charge his phone while Dr. Reed confirmed their seat assignments at the counter. Their seats were not together. Dr. Reed's was in economy, a standard booking made weeks ago. Caleb had an economy seat as well, 24C, which he had studied the night before on the airline's seat map with the focused seriousness of someone who had never flown much and wanted to be prepared for it. What happened at the gate was not planned by anyone. A gate agent named Roy, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a salt and pepper mustache and the kind of unhurried manner that comes from years of absorbing other people's travel stress without internalizing it, had been watching the boarding area for the last 30 minutes. He had watched Caleb notice an elderly woman struggling to lift her bag onto the overhead rack of a nearby waiting area. Seat get up without hesitation and lift it for her. He had watched Caleb offer his charging outlet to a young mother whose toddler was crying and whose phone was at 4% and who looked like she hadn't slept. He had watched Caleb do these things without looking around to see if anyone noticed, which was the detail Roy always paid attention to. Roy waited until Dr. Reed had stepped away to take a phone call, then quietly asked Caleb for his boarding pass. He looked at it for a moment, typed something, printed something, and handed Caleb a new boarding pass without any particular ceremony. Seat 4B, first class. You've got a good flight, Roy said, and went back to his podium. Caleb stared at the new boarding pass for a long moment. Then he took a photo of it on his phone the same way he had taken a photo of the Senate letter when it arrived, not to show anyone but to have proof that it was real. He showed it to Dr. Reed when she came back, and she looked at it, and then she looked at him, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to one. "Go on then," she said. "I'll be 30 rows behind you. Text me when you're settled." He boarded ahead of her, carrying his backpack and his broken zippered carry-on, and his composition notebook tucked under one arm, walking down the jet bridge toward a first-class cabin he had never sat in before, on his way to a city where the next morning he would sit in front of some of the most powerful people in the country and try to explain to them clearly and without flinching why the books mattered. He found seat 4B. He stowed his carry-on. He settled in, arranged his notebook on his tray table, and looked around at the wide seats and the soft lighting and the careful, practiced attentiveness of the flight crew, with the slightly dazed expression of someone not fully convinced this was happening. Then the woman in seat 4A sat down and the day changed. Englewood sits on the south side of Chicago like a neighborhood that the rest of the city has been trying to forget for decades, though the people who live there have not forgotten it. Have not been able to afford the luxury of forgetting it, because Englewood is where their families are, and where their churches are, and where their corner stores are, and where the schools are that their children walk to every morning, whether the buildings are crumbling or not, whether the libraries are stocked or not, whether anyone outside a 10-block radius has ever heard their names or not. Caleb James grew up on South Loomis Boulevard in a second-floor apartment that his mother Sandra rented for the entirety of his childhood, a 2-bedroom place with good light in the mornings and a radiator that clanged through the winter nights in a way that Caleb eventually stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing something that has always been there. Sandra James worked double shifts at St. Bernard Hospital 3 and sometimes 4 days a week. Not because she wanted to, but because the math of keeping Caleb fed and clothed, and in a school with working heating, required it. She was a hospital aide, quiet and efficient, and deeply respected by everyone who worked alongside her. A woman who had learned early that the most reliable form of dignity was competence, was showing up and doing the work so thoroughly that no one could question your right to be there. Caleb's father had left when Caleb was 6. This is not a central fact of the story, not the wound that explains everything, but it is a fact, a quiet absence that shaped the particular texture of the apartment on South Loomis Boulevard. The way dinner was a conversation between 2 people instead of 3, the way Sandra worked double shifts partly because she had to, and partly because the work kept her from sitting too long with the silence. Caleb grew up understanding that the absence of something could define a space just as much as its presence. He would understand this later in a different way when he walked into his school library for the first time. The library at his elementary school had 212 books. He counted them once in 4th grade, going shelf by shelf with a piece of paper and a pencil, because a teacher had challenged the class to estimate the number, and he took the challenge more literally than intended. 212 books for 416 students. Some of the spines were cracked and the pages were soft with handling, and a few of the covers were held on with tape. The newest book on the shelf had a copyright date from 11 years earlier. There was no fantasy section, no science fiction section, no poetry beyond a single anthology that someone had donated, and almost nothing that reflected the faces of the children who came through that library's door every day and ran their fingers along the spines looking for themselves. Caleb was 11 years old when he found the copy of Invisible Man. Someone had donated it tucked between two outdated science textbooks on a bottom shelf, and the librarian, a tired, kind woman named Mrs. Okafor, who was not related to the senator, and who juggled the library alongside 3 other administrative responsibilities, had shelved it without having the time to truly consider where it belonged. Caleb pulled it out because the title confused him, and he read the first paragraph standing in the aisle, and then he sat down on the floor and read the next 10 pages, and when the bell rang he checked it out and took it home and read it in his bedroom over 3 days with the intensity of someone encountering for the first time a story that seemed to know they existed. He couldn't have articulated then what it did to him. He was 11, and the vocabulary for it would come later. What he knew was that it made him feel for the first time that books could be written for people like him about people like him, and that there was something deeply wrong with the fact that this particular book had been sitting on a bottom shelf in a cracked library for years before a 4th grader happened to find it by accident. He started collecting books the following summer. Not buying them he had no money for buying, but gathering them the way someone might gather useful things left behind after a storm. Garage sales first, where he would go on Saturday mornings with the $12 he had saved from recycling cans and come home with a paper bag of paperbacks. Then church sales, where he learned that congregations routinely donated boxes of books that ended up in closets because no one had a plan for them. Then, a neighbor on the 4th floor, an old man named Mr. Gaines, who was moving to his daughter's house and who had an entire bookcase he couldn't take with him, who gave Caleb everything on it and helped him carry it down the stairs box by box. By the end of that summer, Sandra's hallway was lined on both sides with books, mystery novels, and memoirs, and biographies, and children's classics, and 3 different copies of the same James Baldwin essay collection, and a complete set of encyclopedias from 1987 that Caleb kept because he thought they might be useful to someone even if they were outdated. Sandra navigated the hallway sideways without complaint. She understood what her son was doing even before he did. His best friend, Deshaun Harris, lived 2 buildings down and had the particular gift of being enthusiastic about whatever Caleb was doing without needing to understand why, which made him invaluable. Deshaun helped Caleb drag a folding table from the church basement to the sidewalk in front of their school on a Tuesday morning in August. 40 books arranged in rows, a piece of cardboard with "Free Take One, Bring One Back." "If you can," written in Caleb's best handwriting with a black marker. They stood beside that table for 4 hours. They gave away 37 books. 3 kids came back the same afternoon with books of their own to leave. Deshaun looked at the 3 books left on the table at the end of the day and said with complete sincerity, "I think this is a thing." He was not wrong. The letters took Caleb 3 weeks to write. He was 13 years old, and he had decided with the absolute unsentimental logic of someone who had been trying to solve a problem with limited resources for 2 years that he needed to go directly to the people who made the books. He drafted a letter that he revised 17 times a letter that explained without self-pity and without exaggeration what the library at his school looked like and what the shelves at the libraries in his neighborhood looked like, and what he believed would happen to a child's relationship with reading if those shelves were never full of books that reflected their lives back at them. He sent that letter to 30 publishing houses. 3 responded. The first response came from a small independent press in Vermont that sent him a box of 23 books with a handwritten note from an editor who said she had read his letter 3 times. The second came from a larger house that offered to connect him with their community outreach coordinator, a conversation that led to a donation of 240 books over the following 6 months. The third response was a form letter politely declining. 27 responses never came. Caleb logged every rejection in his composition notebook not because he was dwelling on them, but because he had decided early that keeping records of what didn't work was as important as keeping records of what did. He had read enough biographies of scientists and inventors to understand that failure documented carefully was a form of information. He kept the letter from the Vermont editor alongside the logged rejections, and he kept the count of donated books on the inside back cover, updating it every week in pencil. The grant applications came next. He applied to 7 foundations in his first year using library computers and borrowing Dr. Reed's grant writing guide from the Howard University website before he had ever met her. He was rejected by all 7. He applied to 6 more the following year. Rejected by 5, waitlisted by 1, which felt at the time like a triumph. The waitlist never became a yes. He kept applying. He kept collecting. He kept renting the folding table. What changed was the church basement. Pastor Wendell Hayes at New Life Baptist on South Halsted had known Sandra James for 15 years and had watched Caleb grow up in the church the way pastors watch children grow up when they are paying attention, which Pastor Hayes always was. When Caleb explained at 14 that he needed a place to store and organize books that was not his mother's hallway because the stack had grown to the point where Sandra was turning sideways to get to the bathroom, Pastor Hayes took him down to the basement, a large clean space used on Sundays for fellowship and the rest of the week for nothing in particular, and told him to take what he needed and keep it organized. Caleb organized it with the focused seriousness of someone designing a library from scratch because that was what he was doing. Deshawn helped him build shelves from donated lumber. They sorted books by age level, then by genre, then most importantly by whether the stories centered Black characters, Latino characters, Asian characters with disabilities, characters whose families looked like the families of the children who would be reading them. That last sorting was the one Caleb spent the most time on. He had never forgotten the feeling of standing in the library aisle at 11 years old and finding by accident the book that felt written for him. He wanted that feeling to be available on purpose. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune named Claire Montoya wrote 800 words about the church basement library in February of the year Caleb turned 15. She had heard about it from a school principal who had received a donation of 90 books and called the paper because she thought it was worth knowing about. The article ran on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, Caleb's email inbox, a Gmail account he had created specifically for Page by Page, had 43 messages in it. By Sunday, it had over 200. The article got picked up by the Associated Press the following week. Then by a national education news outlet, then by a parenting blog with a large following that shared it under the headline, "A 15-year-old is doing what Congress hasn't." Caleb read that headline sitting in the church basement surrounded by boxes of books and felt something complicated, gratitude and embarrassment, and a sharp awareness that the attention would bring resources, but also expectations, and that the expectations would require him to be more organized than he currently was. Dr. Yvonne Reed read the Tribune article at her desk at Howard University on a Thursday afternoon. She was between classes and she read the whole thing twice, and then she looked up the email address at the bottom and wrote Caleb a message that was 3 paragraphs long, professionally courteous and very specific about what she was offering and what she thought she could help him with. She was a professor who had spent her career studying the gap between education policy as written and education as experienced by children in underfunded communities. She had been looking, she wrote, for a practitioner to work with someone doing the work on the ground, not just studying it. She was not expecting the practitioner to be 15. When they met on a video call the following Saturday morning, Dr. Reed had her notes ready and her questions prepared. Caleb had his composition notebook open and a list of things he wanted to know about grant applications. They talked for 2 hours. By the end, she had agreed to become the faculty advisor for Page by Page's formal registration as a non-profit organization, and Caleb had agreed to let her help him apply for grants he had previously been turned down for, because, as she explained with the direct kindness of someone who does not believe in softening the truth, he had been writing them incorrectly. By the time Caleb was 16, Page by Page had placed 11,000 books in schools and community centers across 9 states. Several of those schools had reported measurable improvements in reading engagement scores within the first year of receiving the donations. A principal in rural Georgia sent Caleb a photograph of a 3rd-grade class sitting in a circle on a rug, each child holding a book, with a character on the cover who looked like them. Every face pointed downward in the particular absorbed silence of children who are actually reading. Caleb taped the photograph to the inside cover of his composition notebook next to the letter from the Vermont editor. The letter from the Senate arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in March, and Sandra James saw it first because she got home from her morning shift before Caleb got back from school. She recognized the return address, the Senate of the United States, the seal, the Washington, D.C. zip code, and she set it on the kitchen table and sat down in the chair across from it and did not open it because it was addressed to her son and she believed deeply and practically in the privacy of mail. But she also did not get up, not for a long time. She just sat there looking at the envelope on the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap, the way she sat in church when something was moving through her that she needed to be still for. When Caleb came through the door at 3:40 and saw his mother's face, he knew before he saw the envelope. Senator Patricia Okafor was the first black woman to chair the Senate Subcommittee on Education Equity, and she had held that position for 14 months, during which she had been quietly, methodically building toward a piece of legislation that had the potential to direct $400 million in federal funding toward school library resources in historically underfunded communities. The bill was real and the funding was real, but the bill was stalled, held in committee by members who were not opposed to libraries in principle, but who needed to be reminded in specific and human terms why this particular funding gap mattered and what it cost children who grew up on the wrong side of it. Senator Okafor's staff had found Page by Page through the Associated Press story, had cross-referenced it with Dr. Reed's published research on reading equity, and had spent 3 weeks debating whether a 17-year-old testifying before the subcommittee was good strategy or a distraction. Senator Okafor ended the debate herself. She had read Caleb's grant applications, Dr. Reed had forwarded them, and she said that anyone who could write about the specific gravity of an empty library shelf with that kind of precision and that kind of lack of self-pity deserved to say it out loud in a room where it might actually change something. Caleb opened the envelope at the kitchen table with his mother sitting across from him. He read the letter once, carefully moving his lips slightly, the way he did when he was reading something he wanted to make sure he understood fully. Then he set it down. Then he looked up at Sandra. Sandra James, who had not cried when the hospital told her she would need to pick up a 3rd shift, who had not cried when the landlord raised the rent, who had not cried at any of the 77 small disasters of the past decade of her life, put her face in her hands and cried. Caleb took a photo of her with the letter on the table in front of her, the envelope and the Senate seal visible in the frame. He kept it on his phone. He would keep it there for years. The logistics of the trip fell to Dr. Reed, who handled them with her characteristic efficiency. She booked the flights, arranged the hotel, coordinated with the subcommittee staff about timing and format and the specific parameters of Caleb's testimony. She told him he had 12 minutes, which was longer than most witnesses were given and shorter than he needed, and that he should plan for 10 and leave room for the room. She told him to write everything down and then speak without the paper so that he was talking to people and not reading at them. She told him he was ready, which she would not have said if she did not believe it. The upgraded seat happened at the gate because a gate agent named Roy paid attention to a teenager helping strangers and decided quietly and without fanfare to do something kind. It was the kind of decision that rewrites what happens next without announcing itself. Caleb sat in seat 4B with his composition notebook on his tray table and the first lines of his testimony moving through his head and the city of Chicago spread out below him as the plane climbed, and somewhere in that grid of lights was South Loomis Boulevard and the apartment and the hallway that used to be full of books, and he looked at it until it disappeared into cloud. First class was quieter than he expected. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. Not the wide seats or the extra legroom or the way the flight attendant offered him a warm towel with the practiced ease of someone performing a ritual they had done 10,000 times. But the quiet, the particular well-upholstered hush of a space designed to give people the impression that the world was not quite as loud and crowded and exhausting as it actually was. He stowed his carry-on, carefully checking twice that the zipper on the outside pocket, the broken one, was pushed as far closed as it would go. He settled into the seat and adjusted the headrest and put his composition notebook on his tray table in front of him, and then he sat very still for a moment and simply existed in the unfamiliar space, the way you have to let your eyes adjust to a new kind of light. Dr. Reed texted from economy while the plane was still boarding. "You've got this. Remember what you're going there for. I'll see you at the gate." He typed back. Notebook checked 3 times. "I'm good." He was mostly good. He was also acutely aware of the woman who had settled into seat 4A while he was stowing his bag. Platinum blonde hair, precisely styled. A tailored jacket in deep navy that sat on her shoulders with the easy authority of very expensive clothes. A diamond bracelet on her left wrist that caught the cabin light every time she moved her hand. She had looked at him when he sat down, a brief evaluating look that moved over him in the way that a look can move over a person and communicate everything without a single word being spoken. Then she had turned away and opened her laptop, and Caleb had returned to his notebook, and the plane had begun to pull back from the gate. He reviewed the opening of his testimony, mouthing the words silently. He had the statistics memorized, the funding gap numbers, the reading score data, the specific outcomes from the 9 schools that had shown the most measurable improvement after receiving page-by-page donations. What he was working on was the part that came before the statistics, the part where he had to explain to people who had never stood in the library at his elementary school what it actually felt like to look at shelves that were mostly empty, and understand even as a child what that emptiness was telling you about your worth. He was reaching for that explanation in his notes, turning to a page near the middle of the notebook, when he first felt Diana Sloane's eyes on him again. Not a glance this time, but a sustained attention, the kind that had weight to it, the kind that a person can feel on the side of their face, the way they can feel a draft. He kept his eyes on the notebook. He kept his breathing even. Outside the window, Chicago was already far below. Diana Sloane had been flying first class for so long that she had stopped noticing it in the way you stop noticing things that have become simply the condition of your life, the baseline from which everything else is measured. She flew first class the way she wore the diamond bracelet, not as a display, but as a fact, as the natural consequence of 20 years of building something that she believed she had earned entirely through her own effort and judgment and the particular clarity with which she understood how the world worked. She was a corporate relocation consultant, which meant she was the person that Fortune 500 companies called when they needed to move senior executives from one city to another, when they needed someone to manage the logistics and the optics and the inevitable resentments that came with uprooting a highly compensated person from one life and reconstructing it somewhere else. She was very good at it. She had been very good at it for 20 years, had built her firm from a single-office consultancy in suburban Atlanta into a 12-person operation with clients in 11 cities, and the first-class seat on American Airlines Flight 417 was one of the 83 first-class flights she would take this year, a number she knew because she tracked it the way she tracked everything that confirmed the shape of the life she had built. The platinum blonde hair was precisely the shade she had maintained for 11 years, colored every 6 weeks by the same stylist she had been seeing since she moved to Chicago. A woman who understood that for Diana this was not vanity, but consistency. The same impulse that made her fold her boarding pass in half before putting it in her left jacket pocket, that made her always request the same seat on this route, that made her feel when she saw Caleb James settle into seat 4B beside her. Something she would not have been able to name accurately if asked, but that lived in the body as a kind of tightening a resistance, a sense that the order she relied on had been quietly disturbed. She did not think of herself as a person who made assumptions. She thought of herself as a person who read situations accurately, who had developed over decades of professional life spent assessing people and environments a reliable sense for when something was out of place. She had examined this belief so rarely that it had become invisible to her the way a lens becomes invisible when you've been looking through it long enough that you've forgotten it's there. That morning had already been difficult before she boarded. A call at 6:15 from her largest client, a Chicago-based manufacturing company that had been with her firm for 7 years, during which their VP of Human Resources informed her in the carefully neutral language of someone delivering unwelcome news that they were reviewing their contracts with all external consultants and would be in touch. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the message was not, and Diana had spent the car ride to the airport with the call playing on a loop in her head, running the numbers, recalculating, restructuring the scenario in ways that arrived at better outcomes, and then refusing to hold together under scrutiny. She had boarded Flight 417 frayed in a way that she was skilled at concealing a hairline fracture beneath the tailored jacket and the diamond bracelet and the automatic confidence of her posture. She needed this flight to be the thing it always was quiet, controlled hers in the particular way that first class had always been hers, and the presence of a teenage boy in the seat beside her, a boy with a backpack that didn't belong in this cabin, and a broken zipper and a handwritten notebook that he was reading with the intense, slightly anxious focus of someone preparing for something, was a disruption to that expectation that she felt physically like a wrong note in a familiar piece of music. She told herself she was not staring. She was assessing. She was, as she always was, simply reading the situation. The escalation was gradual enough that each individual step seemed almost deniable, which was perhaps the point. Or perhaps Diana Sloan was simply doing what people do when they are not fully honest with themselves about what they are doing, which is proceeding one small step at a time, so that no single step feels like a choice. It began with the armrest. The armrest between seats 4A and 4B was a shared space by design, and Caleb had been using his half of it with the careful, self-contained economy of someone accustomed to making themselves small in unfamiliar places. Diana shifted her elbow into the center of it with the deliberate casualness of someone who considered the entire armrest hers to begin with, and when Caleb's arm was displaced, he moved it to his lap without comment and went back to his notebook. Then there were the sighs, not the unconscious sighs of fatigue or distraction, but the particular audible exhalations of someone registering displeasure, a sound calibrated to be heard by the person beside them, without being loud enough to constitute a public declaration. Diana sighed when Caleb shifted in his seat. She sighed when he turned a page in his notebook. She sighed when he quietly asked the flight attendant, Brooke, for a glass of water, as though the requesting of water in a first-class cabin were itself an imposition. Brooke, who was 28 and new to the first-class rotation, and deeply invested in avoiding conflict on her flights, heard the sighs and saw the dynamic, and chose in the particular way that people choose when they are simultaneously aware that something wrong is happening and unwilling to accept the cost of naming it, to do nothing to keep moving, to tell herself it wasn't her place. Nora Haynes in seat 3. A heard the sighs and saw the armrest and did not look away. Look, she had been a federal judge for 22 years. She had watched people be cruel in courtrooms with the efficient minimalism of those who have learned that cruelty delivered quietly carries farther and costs the victim more than cruelty delivered loudly, because loud cruelty at least announces itself and gives the witness a clear choice of response. What she was watching in row 4 was the quiet kind. She folded her newspaper in her lap and watched. When the flight attendant came through with drinks, Diana requested her white wine, and then, while Brooke was still placing the cup on Caleb's tray, said in a voice pitched precisely to carry to the row behind them, but not beyond it. First class does have a certain standard, doesn't it? It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that is designed to mean exactly what it says to the person it's aimed at, and nothing at all to anyone who might be listening from the outside. Caleb kept his eyes on his notebook. His hand tightened slightly on the pen, a barely visible tension in the knuckle. He did not look up. Then Diana leaned slightly toward him, not enough to be obvious, just enough to establish proximity, and asked in a tone of theatrical puzzlement whether he was quite sure he was in the right seat. Her phrasing was careful. Quite sure I only ask because there must have been some mix-up at the gate. Each word chosen to be a question while functioning as a statement to perform polite concern while delivering a message that had nothing polite in it. Caleb set down his pen. He reached into the front pocket of his backpack, retrieved his boarding pass, and held it out to her without speaking. His name. The flight number. Seat 4B. She looked at it the way someone looks at a piece of evidence they have already decided is incorrect. Then she handed it back. "Airlines make mistakes," she said, and turned back to her laptop. Several passengers in nearby seats shifted in that uncomfortable way of people who have heard something they cannot unhear and have not yet decided what to do with it. A man in seat 5. C. Owen Tran, a software engineer in his early 30s traveling to D.C. for a conference, looked up from his laptop and looked at Caleb and then at Diana and then back at his screen, and the thought he had in that moment, which he would describe later in a tweet that was quoted in 4 separate national news articles, was that he had felt his stomach drop in the particular way it drops when you realize you are about to watch something you cannot stop. Caleb picked up his pen. He found his place in his notebook. He began reading again. Diana's voice had dropped lower now, but not quieter. It had taken on the particular hissing quality of pressure finding a narrow exit. She was speaking to the space between them rather than to him, directly muttering about standards and gatekeeping and what it meant to earn your place, rather than have it handed to you every word aimed with precision while maintaining the technical cover of having been directed at no one. "You don't belong here," she said, and this time she said it clearly, distinctly loud enough for the row behind them and the row in front of them to hear it without any ambiguity at all about who she was saying it to. Caleb looked up. When Caleb James looked up from his composition notebook and met Diana Sloane's eyes for the first time in the full, direct, unguarded way, not the careful peripheral awareness he had been maintaining, not the studied neutrality of someone who has decided not to give a person the reaction they're looking for, but actual eye contact held something in Diana's expression shifted in a way she probably didn't intend. There was a flicker of something that might, in a person capable of reflection in that moment, have resolved into hesitation. Instead, it resolved into fury, the specific fury of someone who expected to be looked away from and wasn't. "I said," Diana said, her voice now at a volume that required no interpretation from any passenger in any nearby seat, "that trash like you doesn't belong in first class. Get up, get your things, and go back to economy where you came from before I make you." The cabin went silent. Not the gradual fading of conversation that happens when people become generally aware that something is happening nearby, but the instant complete silence of a room in which everyone has heard something at the same moment and no one yet knows what comes next. Heads turned. A child somewhere behind the first-class divider asked a question and was immediately quietly shushed. The sound of the engines became suddenly very present, the way background noise becomes audible only when everything else stops. Caleb did not move. He held Diana's gaze for another moment, not defiantly, not aggressively, but with the steady, deliberate composure of someone who has been here before, who has stood in this particular weather many times, and knows that the only protection available is the refusal to be moved from the person you are. Then he looked down at his notebook. "I'm in my assigned seat," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." The words were measured and clear, and they cost him something that no one in the cabin could see because underneath the steadiness there was a 17-year-old who had gotten up that morning thinking about his testimony and about the senators, and about whether he would be able to say everything he needed to say in 12 minutes. Not about this, never about this. Even though some part of him had always known from long experience that this was always somewhere on the horizon. Diana's patience, what remained of it. The thin, professional veneer she had been slowly shedding for the past 40 minutes snapped. Trash, she said, the word landing like a closed fist. That's what you are. Sitting there with your little notebook like you have any business being within 10 feet of this cabin. You are trash, and I will not share a seat with you for another minute. Do you understand me? Move. Now. The passenger in 5C. Owen Tran had his phone out. He was not thinking consciously about recording. His hand had moved before his mind caught up the reflex of someone who understood on a level below decision-making that what was happening needed to be witnessed. Nora Haynes had gone very still in seat 3. Her newspaper completely forgotten, her eyes moving between Diana and Caleb with the attentive precision of someone who is not watching passively but archiving. Caleb stood halfway from his seat. Not to leave, he would explain this later, and explain it clearly, but because the physical pressure of the situation, the raised voice, the sustained aggression had produced in him an involuntary response, the body's instinct to create distance from a threat, and he was halfway between sitting and standing with his hand on the back of the seat in front of him when Diana Sloane's hand moved. The slap landed on the left side of his face. The sound of it, the sharp, flat crack of palm against cheek, moved through the first-class cabin the way sound moves through a small, enclosed space with nothing soft enough to absorb it. Several passengers flinched visibly. A woman 2 rows back made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. Owen's phone was recording. Nora Haynes removed her reading glasses and set them on her tray table with a precision that had nothing accidental about it. Caleb's head had snapped to the right with the impact, and his hand went to his cheek and his composition notebook, the 41 pages of handwritten testimony. The statistics and the stories and the small stars drawn next to the lines he most wanted to remember slid from his tray table and fell to the floor of the cabin, landing face down between his seat and the one in front. He stood there for a moment, his hand on his face, and he did not cry, though the muscles around his eyes were working against it with the kind of effort that is visible to anyone paying close enough attention. He looked at the notebook on the floor. Brooke, the flight attendant, was standing at the back of the first-class section with her hands at her sides, and the carefully maintained expression of someone trying to determine what the correct response was to a situation for which her training had not fully prepared her. She took one step forward. At the front of the cabin, the intercom panel on the wall beside the cockpit door showed a small, steady light, the signal that the flight crew had activated internal monitoring. Someone in the cockpit had been listening. Someone in the cockpit had heard everything. The cockpit of a commercial aircraft is designed to be a space of controlled information. Everything that enters it passes through a filter of protocol and procedure, measured against checklists and hierarchies, and the accumulated institutional logic of an industry that has learned through long and sometimes catastrophic experience that the management of human emotion at 30,000 feet requires structure. Captain James Whitfield had spent 27 years in that structure, had come to value it the way you value things that have kept you alive, and kept the people in your care alive. And he did not, as a rule, allow the texture of what was happening in the cabin behind him to penetrate the particular quality of focused calm he maintained in the left seat. He had heard arguments before. He had heard crying babies and angry passengers, and the strained voices of flight attendants managing situations that were escalating. He had heard all of it through the intercom and through the filtered reports of his crew, and he had in most cases trusted his crew to handle it, because that was what the structure required, and because in most cases the structure worked. He was listening now because Brooke's voice, when she triggered the flight deck intercom, had something in it that fell outside the range of the manageable situations he had learned to calibrate at distance. It was a quality of shaking that she was trying to suppress and not fully succeeding at, and that quality told him, before she had delivered a single specific detail, that what had happened in the first-class cabin was not a manageable situation in the normal sense of the term. She described it quickly and accurately. A passenger in 4A had verbally abused the teenager in 4B, escalating over the past 30 to 40 minutes, culminating in the use of a racial slur, and then physical contact, a slap across the face. The passenger in 4B appeared to be a minor traveling alone. The flight attendant, Brooke herself, had not intervened during the escalation, and her voice carried the particular strain of someone who was simultaneously trying to do her job and accounting in real time for the fact that she had failed to do it earlier. Captain Whitfield listened to all of this without speaking. His first officer, Dana Chen, was flying the aircraft with her eyes on the instruments, and Whitfield was aware of her presence the way you are aware of a steady thing when everything else is in motion. When Brooke finished, the cockpit was quiet for several seconds. Whitfield thought about his son, Eli, who was 16, and played basketball and rode the Chicago Transit Authority's Red Line home after late practices in the dark. A 6-foot black teenager in a hoodie with headphones in moving through a city that had on various occasions, and in various ways, given both of them reason to understand that the world did not always extend to Eli the assumption of innocence and belonging that it extended so automatically to his father. Whitfield had talked to his son about this many times in the careful and exhausting and necessary way that fathers in their situation had these conversations. And he had thought many times about the people who had witnessed the particular cruelties of Eli's experience and had looked away because it was not their place or their problem or their responsibility. He had been one of those people once in a situation that still came back to him at unexpected moments, a moment years ago, when he had stayed in his seat because he told himself someone else would handle it, and someone else hadn't. He stared through the cockpit windshield at the Atlantic horizon for a moment. A flat expanse of light above the clouds, the particular piece of altitude that he had loved for 27 years, and that seemed right now very far from what was happening 30 rows behind him. He told First Officer Chen to hold the course, then he unbuckled his harness. The cockpit door opening mid-flight is the kind of thing that passengers notice immediately, the way they would notice a fire alarm in a building where alarms never go off, not with panic, but with the particular sharpening of attention that happens when something departs from the expected order of a journey you had understood to be routine. The captain did not belong in the cabin. The cabin was the crew's domain. If the captain was in the cabin, something had been decided. Captain Whitfield stepped through the doorway and moved with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who understood that the manner of his entrance was itself a form of communication, that the sight of his uniform and his silver hair and his particular quality of calm moving down the aisle was already changing the atmosphere of the cabin before he had said a single word. Passengers straightened. A man in row 6 who had been documenting the altercation on his phone lowered it slightly, then raised it again. Whitfield walked without rushing. He looked at the cabin around him with the practiced assessment of someone who has managed crises long enough to read the emotional temperature of a space at a glance. The tight-braced expressions of passengers who had witnessed something and were waiting to see how it would be handled. The way Brooke was standing just slightly too still at the edge of the first-class section, the rigid, furious posture of the woman in seat 4A, and Caleb, standing half out of seat 4. B, one hand still against his cheek, the red mark visible from 3 rows away, the composition notebook face down on the floor between his feet. Whitfield stopped at the aisle beside row 4. He looked at Caleb for a moment without speaking, and then he did something that no one in the cabin expected. He bent down and picked up the composition notebook from the floor, and he straightened and he held it out to Caleb. Caleb took it. His hands were not fully steady, and the slight tremor in his fingers as he closed them around the notebook was something Whitfield noticed and did not remark on because it did not require remark. It required only acknowledgement, the kind that is conveyed not in words, but in the act of having crossed a cabin and picked something up off the floor and returned it to the person it belonged to without making a performance of the gesture. "Are you all right, son?" Whitfield said quietly. Caleb looked at him. He nodded. "Yes, sir," he said. His voice was steady. His hands were not. Whitfield turned to Diana Sloane. She met his eyes with an expression that was still holding on to the residue of confidence, the practiced authority of a woman who had spent 2 decades in rooms where her assessments of situations were rarely challenged and had not yet fully registered that this room right now was not one of those. She had expected the captain's arrival to result in a conversation, a negotiation, a resolution in which the airline's interest in keeping a platinum-level frequent flyer satisfied would be weighed against the complaint of a teenager no one had ever heard of. She had not expected the expression on Whitfield's face, which was not angry and not theatrical, but simply clearly and completely resolved. He did not argue with her. He did not invite her version of events. He looked at the mark on Caleb's face, and then he looked at Diana Sloane, and he said in the same quiet voice, "I need you to remain in your seat, ma'am." Then he turned to Brooke, who was standing at the rear of the first-class section with her arms at her sides and her expression cycling between relief and residual guilt and the careful professionalism she was working to reassemble around both of them, and he said in a voice low enough that it reached her and not much further, "Restraint kit, please." Diana's composure fractured. Her voice rose. She invoked her platinum frequent flyer status. She demanded to speak with a supervisor. She used the phrase, "Do you have any idea who I am?" with the specific desperate energy of someone who has always found that phrase effective and is encountering for the first time a situation in which it is not. Whitfield listened to all of it without responding to any of it. He simply waited with the patience of a man who had spent 27 years waiting for turbulence to pass until Brooke returned with the kit. Brooke's hands were steady when she returned with the restraint kit. Whatever had been shaking in her voice on the intercom had resolved itself in the interval or had been set aside. The arrival of the captain had provided something she had not been able to provide herself in the preceding 40 minutes. Which was a clear, authoritative decision about what the right thing to do was, and Brooke had always been capable of acting once the decision was made. It was the making of it in the absence of certainty that she had failed at. The zip tie went around Diana Sloane's wrists with a sound that was quiet and final. Diana had not stopped talking. She was making promises and threats in the particular register of someone who has spent a career understanding leverage and is trying desperately to identify what leverage she has left and finding the inventory shorter than expected. Her diamond bracelet caught the overhead light of the first-class cabin as the restraint was applied around it. A small, absurd incongruity. The expensive jewelry and the plastic zip tie. The trappings of the life she had built, framed by the practical consequence of what she had done. Several passengers were filming. Owen Tran, in seat 5C, had been filming since before the slap. His phone angled carefully and held steady with the calm of someone who had decided early that the most useful thing he could do in this situation was ensure that what was happening was recorded accurately. He did not narrate, did not editorialize, did not speak. He simply held the phone steady and let the lens do what lenses do. Nora Haynes did not take out her phone. She watched with the particular quality of attention that 22 years on the bench had given her, total, precise, and retentive in the way that matters most, which is not in the moment but afterward when you are asked to give an account. She waited until Whitfield had finished instructing Brooke and the second flight attendant who had arrived to manage the situation, and then she spoke. "Captain." Her voice was measured and clear, the voice of a person accustomed to rooms where clarity of speech is not optional. "My name is Nora Haynes. I'm a retired federal judge. I sat on the 7th Circuit for 22 years. I witnessed everything that occurred in this row from the moment it began. I will provide a complete statement to law enforcement at whatever point you deem appropriate." Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." He said it with a brevity that contained, if you were listening for it, a considerable amount of relief not at having an ally, because he hadn't needed one, but at the knowledge that the record of what had happened in row 4 would be accurate and complete and beyond challenge. He looked at Caleb one more time. The teenager was back in his seat, his composition notebook on the tray table in front of him, his hands folded on top of it. The red mark on his cheek was deepening slightly. His expression was not what Whitfield expected, not shaken, not tearful, not even particularly angry. It was composed in the way that something is composed when enormous effort is being applied to keeping it that way, the way a person looks when they have been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and have become so accustomed to the weight that even setting it down feels dangerous. Whitfield returned to the front of the cabin. He paused at the cockpit door, took one breath that was not visible to anyone watching him, and picked up the passenger intercom handset. His voice came through the cabin speakers with the same quality it carried in person, unhurried, clear, and carrying within its steadiness the particular authority of someone whose steadiness costs him something real and who expends it deliberately. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Whitfield. I need to inform you that, due to an incident involving the assault of a minor passenger in our first-class cabin, this aircraft will be diverting to Pittsburgh International Airport, where law enforcement officers will be boarding to handle the situation. We expect to be on the ground within approximately 40 minutes. I want to thank you for your patience and your understanding, and I want to assure you that the safety and dignity of every passenger on this aircraft is my responsibility and my priority. We'll have more information for you shortly." He set the handset back in its cradle. The cabin was quiet for a moment. Not the stunned paralysis of the slap, but a different quality of silence. The kind that follows a decision that cannot be undone when the space fills briefly with the weight of what has just been committed to. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the cabin, a single passenger began to clap. Slowly at first, uncertain whether the sound would be met or would stand alone. Then another passenger joined, and another, and within a few seconds the applause had spread through both sections of the aircraft in the unorchestrated, slightly ragged way that genuine collective feeling expresses itself without coordination and without artifice, because it doesn't need either. Diana Sloane sat in seat 4A with her wrists restrained and her eyes forward, and her face arranged into an expression that was no longer performing anything because there was no longer any audience she could perform for. The people around her were not watching her with the deference she had always occupied so easily. They were watching her with something much harder to sit with. In seat 4, B. Caleb James opened his composition notebook to the first page of his testimony. He found his place. He read the sentence he had been reaching for when this had all begun, the one about the library shelf and what emptiness communicates to a child, and he picked up his pen and made a small annotation in the margin. He was still going to Washington. He had 12 minutes to fill, and not one word of it had changed. The 40 minutes between the captain's announcement and the wheels of Flight 417 touching down at Pittsburgh International Airport had a texture entirely unlike the 40 minutes that had preceded it. The atmosphere of the first-class cabin had shifted in the way that a room shifts after a window is opened, something that had been accumulating in the sealed air finally having a way out. People returned to their drinks, to their laptops, to the books they had been pretending to read while they were actually monitoring the situation in row 4, but they returned to these things differently, with the slightly recalibrated awareness of people who have been in the presence of something and are still processing what it means. Conversations started in low, careful voices between strangers who had not spoken during the entire flight before now. A woman in row 6 leaned across the aisle to the man in row 6 opposite her and said something inaudible, and he nodded, and they both glanced toward the front of the cabin. Owen Tran stopped recording and looked at what he had. 47 seconds of clear audible footage. Diana's voice, the specific words, the sound of the slap. Caleb's stillness. The captain's walk down the aisle, the restraint. He watched it through once with his hand shielding the screen from the overhead light, and then he put his phone in his pocket and sat with the footage for a while without doing anything with it, the way you sit with something important before deciding what to do with it. Nora Haynes rose from seat 3A and moved to the empty seat beside Caleb that Brooke had left vacant when she repositioned to supervise Diana. She did not ask if the seat was available. She sat down with the ease of someone who has earned through 7 decades of navigating the world clearly the right to make certain decisions without requiring permission. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Caleb for a moment. "Would you like to tell me what's in the notebook?" she said. Caleb looked at her. He had been aware of her since early in the flight. The deliberateness of her posture, the way she had watched the situation in row 4 with an attention that was different in quality from the uncomfortable avoidance of most of the surrounding passengers. He had not known who she was. He told her about page by page. He told her about the church basement and the 11,000 books and the 9 states and the hearing the following morning. He told her about the $400 million bill and Senator Okafor and the 12 minutes he had been given and the specific thing he was trying to explain in those 12 minutes that was harder to explain than the statistics. The thing about the empty shelf and what a child understands from it. Nora listened, the way she had always listened, with her whole attention, without interrupting, without preparing her response while he was still speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The shelf tells the child whether the people in charge believe they are worth imagining for," she said finally. It was not quite what Caleb had said. It was more precise. He wrote it in the margin of his notebook. Across the aisle, Diana sat rigid and silent, staring at the seat back in front of her. The restraints on her wrists were not tight. Brooke had been careful about that, but they were visible, and the visibility of them was doing something to Diana's face that she did not have enough composure left to fully manage. Brooke came by with water. She placed a bottle on Caleb's tray table and an ice pack folded in a napkin beside it, and she did this without the careful professional neutrality she had been deploying throughout the flight. Her expression now was simply honest, which was its own kind of apology, clearer in some ways than words would have been. Caleb pressed the ice pack gently to his cheek. He kept his other hand on his notebook. 30 rows back, Doctor." Yvonne Reed had known something was wrong before the captain's announcement. She had the particular radar of someone who has spent decades paying attention to the way institutions and the people within them respond to black bodies in spaces where those bodies are deemed unexpected. A sensitivity developed not through paranoia, but through the accumulated data of lived experience and professional study, the kind of knowing that registers in the chest before it resolves in the mind. She had felt it when the plane shifted course, the subtle banking turn that passengers who fly frequently learn to distinguish from the ordinary adjustments of a flight path. Then the captain's voice through the intercom, the careful language of the announcement, the word assault, the word minor, and something in Dr. Reed's body went cold and still before her mind had fully assembled the sequence. She was out of her seat and moving forward before the flight attendant in economy could formulate a response to her movement, and she said, "I need to get to row 4," in a voice that communicated without hostility that this was not a request, and that the most efficient outcome for everyone involved would be to get out of her way. A passenger in row 18 told her in a quick, low summary what had happened. She received this information without expression. She kept walking. She saw Caleb from the divider between economy and first class, the ice pack against his cheek. The woman in 4A restrained the retired judge she did not yet know sitting beside him. She walked to him and she sat down in the aisle seat 1 row ahead. Brooke had repositioned the first-class configuration to give them room, and she looked at Caleb's face with the careful clinical attention of someone assessing damage that they are not going to allow themselves to feel in full until the person in front of them is safe and stable. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened. Dr. Reed's fury was not the kind that announces itself. It was the kind that goes very quiet, that settles into the body like something heavy being set down in exactly the right place, the kind of anger that has been building for long enough that when it finally arrives at its object, it doesn't need to perform itself. She had spent her career fighting through research and policy and academic argument the same belief system that had just produced a platinum-haired woman slapping a black 17-year-old in a first-class cabin because she had decided he did not belong there. She had written papers about it. She had testified about it in contexts far less august than the one Caleb was heading to. She had tried for 20 years to put into careful, evidence-based language what that belief system cost and who paid the price. She looked at the ice pack against Caleb's cheek. The data point was different when it was a face she knew. She became aware that the woman in the seat beside Caleb was watching her with recognition, a quiet, specific recognition, not the generic kind. Dr. Reed looked at her directly. "Nora Haynes," the woman said. Dr. Reed's breath caught very slightly. Nora Haynes. The Seventh Circuit. The 2009 ruling in Harrison versus Illinois State Board of Education, the most significant federal decision on equitable school resource distribution in the previous 20 years. A ruling that Dr. Reed had cited in 14 published papers and had used as the legal foundation for 3 of Page by Page's grant applications. "I know your work, Doctor," Reed said, which was an understatement of such magnitude that it almost functioned as humor. "I know yours," Nora said simply. The 3 of them, Caleb with the ice pack on his cheek and the notebook on his tray table, Dr. Reed with her folders and her fury arranged quietly under the surface. Nora with the particular composed authority of someone who has spent decades ensuring that justice is not merely a concept, but an outcome sat together in the first-class cabin of Flight 417 as it descended toward Pittsburgh, and the weight of the coincidence was not lost on any of them, the way that the particular people you need sometimes arrive before you know you need them. In the last 30 minutes of flight, Diana Sloan had no one to perform for and nothing left to manage. And in that absence, the real work of the moment began. Not remorse, not the sudden moral clarity that dramatic situations are sometimes credited with producing in the people who have caused them, but something more honest, and in its honesty, more damning. She was calculating. This was what Diana did when she was threatened. What she had always done. Not feel her way through a situation, but think her way through it. Map the damage. Identify the variables. Work toward a version of events in which the outcome was manageable. She had done it when clients threatened to leave, when deals fell through, when the professional life she had built hit the various obstacles that all professional lives hit over 20 years and required navigation rather than emotion. She began with the video. She had been aware of the man in 5C filming. She had registered the phone in her peripheral vision at some point during the confrontation, had noted it without the full weight of its implications, landing until now. The video existed. It could not be made not to exist. She needed to account for it. Then the witnesses. The judge in 3A, she had heard the woman identify herself to the captain, had heard the word federal, had felt the particular cold of that word settling over the back of her neck. The professor who had come forward from economy, clearly connected to the boy, clearly possessing her own standing and her own voice. The restrained cabin, the other passengers, Owen Tran's steady phone. Then the boy himself. She had told herself in the heat of the confrontation that he was nobody, that the seat beside her had been filled by some airline error or inexplicable gate decision, with a child who had no particular claim to the space, who would feel the discomfort she created and leave, who would prove by leaving that she had been right about where he belonged. She had heard the word Senate somewhere in the conversation behind her, had caught a fragment about a hearing, had seen the Howard University lanyard on the professor's bag. The notebook that the captain had picked up from the floor. She was not feeling remorse. She was discovering consequence, not the abstract consequence of having done something wrong, but the specific concrete arriving now consequence of having done something wrong on a flight with 40 witnesses and at least 2 working cameras to a person who was not, as it turned out, nobody. This distinction between remorse and consequence was the most accurate and honest thing about Diana Sloane in this moment, and it was ultimately more damning than any performance of regret would have been, because it confirmed what Nora Haynes had understood from the beginning of the situation in row 4, that the cruelty had not been a lapse. It had been a belief expressed, and the belief had not changed, only the math had. Diana stared at the seat back in front of her, and said nothing because there was nothing left to say that would change what 40 million people were eventually going to see. Pittsburgh International Airport, in the mid-morning, carried the specific minor key bustle of a regional hub, not the manic density of O'Hare, but a steady, purposeful movement of travelers and crew and ground staff going about the business of a day that had been, until about 40 minutes ago, unremarkable. The gate crew received the diversion notification and began the adjustments that diversions require: the repositioning of ground equipment, the notification of law enforcement, the rerouting of connecting passengers who would now be delayed and would need to be told why, with the minimum of alarm and the maximum of accuracy. 2 Pittsburgh police officers were waiting at the jet bridge when Flight 417 pulled up to the gate. A third had been stationed at the end of the bridge. The airline's ground supervisor, a compact woman named Helen who had been in aviation operations for 16 years, met them with the calm efficiency of someone who has handled abnormal situations before and has learned that the most useful thing she can contribute is clarity about process. Inside the cabin, Brooke made the announcement that passengers should remain seated while law enforcement boarded. The reaction was muted. Most passengers had spent the last 40 minutes processing the situation and had arrived in various ways at something resembling acceptance. The police officers moved through the cabin to the first-class section with a directness that made clear they had been briefed. They spoke briefly with Whitfield, who had emerged from the cockpit for the second time, and then with Nora Haynes, who provided a summary of her account in the precise, organized language of someone who has spent a professional lifetime understanding exactly what information law enforcement needs and in what order. Diana Sloane was escorted from the aircraft in handcuffs. She walked the length of the first-class cabin without speaking. She kept her eyes forward. The diamond bracelet was still on her wrist below the handcuffs, catching the light with a reflex brightness that had no relationship to the current circumstances. Jewelry does not understand context. Several phones rose as she passed, filming with the quiet documentary attention of people who understood they were witnessing a moment that had not yet finished meaning things. She passed row 4B without looking at it. Caleb watched her go. His expression, if you were watching closely, was not satisfaction. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting for something to end so that they can return to the more important thing they were doing before it started. He looked at Diana Sloane's retreating back for a moment, and then he looked at his notebook. He had 3 more annotations he wanted to make before they landed properly, and he lost his tray table. Nora Haynes pressed her card into his hand while the cabin was still settling. It was a simple card. Her name, a phone number, a Chicago address. No title, no circuit designation, no institutional affiliation. Just her name and how to reach her. "Call me after the hearing," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Doctor." Reed was gathering her folders and her bags with the organized, purposeful movements of someone who has recalculated a schedule and determined that it is still barely workable. They would be rebooked on the next available flight to Washington. The hearing was at 10 the following morning. If they left Pittsburgh by mid-afternoon, they would make it. Captain Whitfield appeared in the cabin for the last time as the remaining passengers prepared to deplane. He moved through the first-class section toward the exit and paused at row 4B. He looked at Caleb, the ice pack set aside. now the notebook closed and tucked under his arm, the composition of someone who has been through something and has decided to carry it as information rather than injury. Whitfield extended his hand. Caleb looked at it for just a moment, at the silver-haired man in the pilot's uniform, who had unbuckled his harness and left the cockpit and picked a notebook up from the floor. And then he took the hand and shook it firmly, the way his mother had taught him to shake hands, with his whole grip and his eyes on the other person's eyes. "Good luck tomorrow," Whitfield said. One sentence. He did not embellish it. He did not explain it. He moved on. Caleb stood in the aisle of the plane for a moment after Whitfield passed the notebook under his arm and the card from Nora Haynes in his pocket, and everything that was waiting for him in Washington filling up the next 12 hours of his life. And he breathed. And then he followed the rest of the passengers off the plane and into whatever came next. Owen Tran posted the video from a seat at the Pittsburgh International Airport rebooking counter while he waited for an agent to reassign his connection. He was not a person with a large social media following. He had 1,400 followers on the platform, a modest number accumulated over years of occasional posts about software development and local restaurant recommendations, and the periodic photographs he took on weekend hikes. He was not thinking about any of that when he posted. He was thinking that what the video contained was important, and that important things in his experience did not become less important for being seen. He wrote no caption except, "This happened on my flight today." The captain's response should be seen by everyone. He put his phone down and waited for the rebooking agent. The video was 47 seconds long. In the first 18 seconds, Diana Sloane's voice was clearly audible, the specific words, the specific volume, the specific character of the contempt in them as Caleb James sat with his hands on the armrests and his eyes forward and did not respond. In seconds 19 through 23, the slap. In seconds 24 through 31, the cabin's reaction, the frozen stillness, the heads turning, the particular quality of the silence. In seconds 32 through 47, Captain James Whitfield, walking the length of the first-class aisle, steady and measured and unhurried and kneeling briefly to retrieve something from the floor beside seat 4B, and handing it to the teenager who was standing beside it. That last gesture, the captain bending to pick up the fallen notebook the moment of returning it, was the 12 seconds that the internet decided mattered most. People who did not have time to watch the full 47 seconds shared clips of those 12. People who watched the full 47 seconds came back to those 12. The economy of the gesture, the absence of performance in it, the way it communicated without announcing itself. What kind of person the captain was. This was the thing that moved from phone to phone and screen to screen, and made people forward it to their mothers and their children and their colleagues with no other message than "watch this." Within 90 minutes of Owen's post, the video had 2 million views. Within 3 hours, it had 7 million. Comment sections filled with the particular mixture of outrage and unexpected specific tenderness that the internet sometimes achieves when the right moment finds it fury at Diana. Relief at Whitfield, something that kept returning in different words and different languages and from accounts in countries Owen would not have thought to name, to the image of the captain picking up the notebook. People described what that image made them feel with a precision and a vulnerability that comment sections rarely generate. They said it made them cry. They said it made them call their own children. They said they hadn't expected to be moved by a 47-second video today, and then they were. The pilot's name was not in Owen's post, but within the first hour, people were asking for it, and within the second hour, someone had found it. Marcus Webb was a reporter at the Washington Post who covered the intersection of aviation and civil rights, a beat he had proposed 3 years ago, and that his editor had approved with the skepticism of someone who did not fully believe the intersection existed until Marcus spent 18 months proving that it did, that the architecture of air travel was threaded through with the same patterns of exclusion and hierarchy that governed the rest of American public life, that the first-class cabin was not a neutral space but a social one, and that what happened in it was worth reporting. He saw Owen's video at 2 hours and 11 minutes after it was posted, sent to him by a reader who followed his work. He watched it 4 times. Then he opened a new document and began making calls. The confirmation of Caleb's identity took 40 minutes. Dr. Reed's faculty page at Howard linked to a Tribune article about Page by Page, which linked to the Associated Press story from the previous year, which contained a direct quote from Caleb that matched the handwriting style visible in the notebook footage, with a specificity that was probably not admissible, but was, for journalistic purposes, definitive. A call to Howard's communications office confirmed that Dr. Yvonne Reed was traveling with a student associated with her education equity research. A call to the Senate Subcommittee's press contact confirmed after a 40-minute hold that Caleb James was scheduled to testify the following morning at 10 a.m. Marcus Webb sat back in his chair with the particular feeling of a story that has arrived fully formed and is asking only to be told accurately. He wrote the first paragraph. A 17-year-old black teenager from Chicago's South Side was slapped by a white passenger in first class on an American Airlines flight Tuesday while traveling to Washington, D.C., where he was scheduled to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Education Equity the following morning. The passenger was restrained and removed from the aircraft after the pilot diverted the flight to Pittsburgh International Airport. The incident was captured on video by a fellow passenger. The video has been viewed over 7 million times. He filed the story at 4:17 p.m. It was on the Post's homepage by 4:45. By 6 p.m., every major national news outlet had picked it up. The narrative the public received contained a detail that no one had fully anticipated. Not the assault itself, not the pilot's response, but the specific context of where Caleb was going and why. The story did not remain a story about a racist incident on an airplane. It became a story about what the country does to the people who are trying to fix its oldest, deepest, most persistent failures, about the specific kind of resilience it requires to be slapped in a first-class cabin on your way to tell the Senate why the books matter, and to sit down afterward and keep reading your testimony. Diana Sloan's corporate website was archived and screenshotted within hours of her name appearing in the Post story. Her clients began going quiet. People were searching for Captain James Whitfield before his name appeared in any official statement. An aviation forum identified him first, cross-referencing the flight number, the route the captain's physical description from Owen's video, and the airline's published crew rotation schedules. Within 6 hours of the video's posting, his name was on every major platform, followed by whatever additional details people could find. 27 years at American Airlines, a previous career flying cargo for the Air Force, a quiet, professional reputation for what his colleagues described when asked as steady. That word steady appeared in more than one account from people who had flown with him or worked alongside him. Not heroic, not brave, not the language of extraordinary acts, but the language of a reliable, consistent, principled ordinary. Steady. The kind of person who does the right thing not because the cameras are on, but because the cameras, being on or off, has never been relevant to how he determines the right thing. He gave no interviews. He issued no statement. When reporters contacted American Airlines for comment on the captain specifically, the airline's communications team said only that Captain Whitfield had acted in accordance with his responsibilities as commanding officer of the aircraft and with the highest standards of the profession. It was a carefully crafted sentence. It was also, in its careful crafting, an endorsement. Veterans communities were among the first to share the story with particular intensity, because the Air Force cargo flying background had surfaced early, and because there is a specific quality of loyalty that military service communities extend to one of their own, who acts with honor in a civilian context. A pride in the continuity of character, the understanding that the kind of person who does what Whitfield did on Flight 417 did not become that person in the moment, but over decades of decisions, most of them unwitnessed. That's an Air Force man, someone wrote in a veterans forum. That's what we look like when it counts. The post was shared 40,000 times. American Airlines issued a fuller public statement that evening, commending the captain's decision and confirming that the passenger had been charged. The statement did not name Diana Sloan, that had been handled through official police channels, but confirmed an arrest. It also announced without fanfare that Caleb James and Dr. Yvonne Reed had been rebooked on the next available flight to Washington, D.C., and that all expenses related to the rebooking had been waived. The phrase that entered the cultural vocabulary fastest was the simplest one: the pilot's response. Not the pilot's heroism, or the pilot's intervention, or the pilot's decision to divert the plane, none of those. Just the pilot's response. As though the response itself was so self-evidently the correct one that describing it required no adjective, only a noun. As though the question had simply been what the right thing to do was, and the pilot had done it, and the doing of it was the whole story. By the following morning, the phrase was trending in 14 countries. Diana Sloan was charged with assault of a minor and held overnight in Pittsburgh pending arraignment. She was represented by a criminal defense attorney from her firm's general counsel's office, a man who had handled employment disputes and contract disagreements and the occasional regulatory inquiry, and who was in the privacy of his own assessment, not sure he had the specific experience this situation required. He advised Diana to say nothing, which was the right advice and which she followed, because the alternative was to speak into a camera, and there were now a great many cameras. Her 3 largest corporate clients released statements cutting ties with her consulting firm before she was arraigned. They did not cite the video specifically. They used language about corporate values and alignment with company culture and mutual agreement to conclude the relationship, the careful, legally reviewed language of institutions distancing themselves from an association that has become, in the precise and unsentimental calculation of corporate risk management, more expensive than it is worth. The consulting firm she had built over 20 years, the 12-person operation with clients in 11 cities. The careful, professional architecture of her life did not survive the week. Not through any dramatic public declaration or formal dissolution, but through the quieter, more complete attrition of a reputation that had been attached to a face that was now attached to a 47-second video. Clients who had not yet left began reviewing their contracts. Staff who had tolerated various smaller expressions of the belief system that had produced the incident on Flight 417 began making other plans. The sentence was handed down 6 weeks later in a Pittsburgh courtroom with no cameras and no public gallery to speak of a guilty plea, community service, and a fine. The judge read the sentence in the measured language of a proceeding that has been concluded rather than begun, and Diana Sloan left the courtroom through a side entrance, and that was the last time she was in the news. Justice, when it comes, does not always come loudly. Sometimes it comes in a side entrance and a courtroom with no cameras, and a number of hours of community service that will be completed and then completed and then completed. What matters is that it comes. The rebooked flight from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. departed at 4:15 in the afternoon and landed at Reagan National just after 6, Caleb and Dr. Reed moved through the airport with the exhausted efficiency of people who have been through a great deal since breakfast and have not yet had the space to process it because the thing waiting on the other side of the processing is too important to process toward. You do not let yourself feel the weight of the day before the hearing. You do the hearing first, and then you feel the weight. The hotel room was quiet. Caleb ordered room service and ate without tasting it, and read his testimony 3 more times, and fell asleep with the composition notebook on the pillow beside him and the television on low, showing a news segment that he was not watching, but that was somewhere in the background, showing a 47-second video that 14 countries were currently discussing. He woke at 5:45. He showered, dressed, put on the pressed shirt and the dark pants that Sandra had ironed and folded into his suitcase with the specific deliberate care of a mother who knows that her son is going somewhere important and wants his clothes to know it too. He picked up the composition notebook. He went to meet Dr. Reed in the lobby. They arrived at the Senate building at 8:45. The marble floors and high ceilings of the Russell Senate office building had the quality of spaces designed to make you feel the accumulated weight of history, rather than just the events of the current morning. And for once, Caleb allowed himself to feel it not as intimidation, but as context. The understanding that the room he was walking toward had held many people making many arguments about what this country owed its citizens, and that his argument was the next one in a very long line. There were reporters outside. More than he and Dr. Reed had anticipated. The story had been moving through the news cycle overnight, and the hearing had been scheduled before any of this happened, but now it was scheduled, and the video existed, and the press had assembled accordingly. Dr. Reed moved through them with practiced efficiency, one hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder to direct him toward the building entrance without stopping. Senator Patricia Okafor met them at the door herself. She was a tall woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the specific seasoned composure of someone who has spent a career in rooms where composure is the most powerful thing you can bring. She looked at Caleb for a moment at the slight discoloration still visible on his left cheek, at the composition notebook under his arm, at the expression of someone who has decided not to be diminished, and she said, "We're glad you made it." It was not the most she could have said. It was, Caleb thought, exactly the right amount. The hearing room was smaller than it looked on the C-SPAN feed that Sandra James was watching from the break room of St. Bernard Hospital, sitting on the edge of a folding chair with her phone in her hand, and the volume turned up as high as it would go without bothering anyone, which was not very high, so she had earbuds in, and she was watching the small rectangle of screen with the intensity of someone for whom every second of what they are watching is costing them something, and is worth every cent of the cost. Caleb sat at the long witness table across from the raised dais, where 5 senators and their aides were arranged. He had a microphone, a glass of water, and his composition notebook open to the first page of his testimony. The nameplate in front of him read, "Caleb James Founder Page-by-Page Initiative." He looked at the nameplate for a moment when he sat down, the way he had looked at the Senate letter on the kitchen table, the way he had looked at the boarding pass for Seat 4B, making it real. Senator Okafor called the hearing to order. She introduced Caleb without mentioning the flight. This was by design, a decision she had made that morning in consultation with her chief of staff, because she wanted the testimony to stand on its own and not be filtered through the drama of the previous day. The room already knew. The room did not need to be told. Caleb opened his notebook. He looked up at the senators. He began not with a statistic, but with a sentence he had written and rewritten for 6 months, the one that had been in the margins of his notebook since the beginning, the one that Nora Haynes had sharpened on the plane into something even more precise. The shelf tells the child whether the people in charge believe they are worth imagining for. He let the sentence sit in the room for a moment. Then he continued. He talked about Englewood not as a problem to be solved, but as a place, a real place with people in it. His mother, who worked double shifts. His friend Deshawn, the pastor who gave him the church basement. The neighbors who gave him books from their closets because they understood what he was doing, even when he didn't. He talked about the library at his elementary school, the 212 books, the copyright date 11 years out of date, the absence of shelves that reflected the faces of the children who came through the door. He talked about the copy of Invisible Man on the bottom shelf found by accident at 11 years old, and what it did to him not in sentimental language but in specific language because he had spent 6 months working out how to say the specific thing rather than the general thing. He said, "It told me that someone had thought it was worth writing a story about a person who looked like me. And the fact that I found it by accident, and that there was only one like it, told me that whoever was in charge of the shelves had not yet decided whether that was worth prioritizing." Several members of the subcommittee were very still. He moved through the statistics, the funding gap numbers, the reading engagement data, the outcome reports from the schools that page by page had reached. He had memorized the numbers so thoroughly that he could deliver them without looking down, could keep his eyes on the people across from him, could see when a number landed and when it didn't, and he adjusted his pacing accordingly, giving space to the ones that needed space. He talked about the $400 million bill carefully, not politically, in the language of what it would actually purchase books in the hands of specific children in specific schools, a narrowing of a specific and measurable gap. He said, "I've placed 11,000 books in 9 states working from a church basement with donated lumber for shelves. I need to know what 11,000 becomes when it has the full weight of the federal government behind it." He said it quietly. He did not perform the line. He said it the way he had said everything like he meant it, which he did entirely without remainder. When he finished, the hearing room was quiet, with the particular quiet of people who have been listening and have now stopped and are sitting with what they heard. Senator Okafor looked down the row at her colleagues, at the senator from Georgia and the senator from Vermont and the 2 from the Midwest, who had been the most uncertain votes on the funding bill, and she looked at each of them for a moment with the measuring patient expression of a woman who has spent a career reading rooms. "The record reflects Mr. James's testimony," she said, "and this committee will be moving this bill to a full vote." Caleb closed his notebook. His hands, for the first time since yesterday morning, were completely steady. The hallway outside the hearing room had the slightly suspended quality of a space where something large has just happened, and the people inside it are still finding their footing in the new arrangement of things. Staff moved with folders and phones and the purposeful velocity of people with next tasks. "Doctor." Reed stood beside Caleb with her coat over her arm, and for a moment neither of them said anything which felt correct, which felt like exactly the right amount of silence for the moment. Caleb's phone showed 347 notifications. He looked at the number for a moment and then put the phone back in his pocket without opening any of them. He walked to the marble steps outside the building, wide, sun-warmed steps that faced a street that was already moving at its usual Washington speed, the particular momentum of a city that processes enormous things and then immediately begins processing the next one. He sat down on the top step. He took out his phone. He called his mother. Sandra James picked up on the first ring. "Caleb." Her voice had the quality of a name that has been held ready for a long time, the syllables worn smooth from being carried so carefully and so long. He told her about the room. He told her about the senators. He told her about the sentence he had written and what Nora Haynes had done to it on the plane, and how he had said it out loud in a Senate chamber with cameras rolling, and how the room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from every other kind of quiet he had experienced in the past 24 hours, which had been a day full of different kinds of quiet. He told her about Senator Okafor's face when she told her colleagues the bill was moving to a full vote. Sandra listened to all of it in the way she had always listened to him fully, without interruption, with the quality of attention that had always made him feel, even in the hardest years, that what he said mattered enough to be heard completely. He did not mean to cry. He had held it through the slap and the ice pack and the Pittsburgh gate and the rebooked flight and the hotel room and the Senate building and the 12 minutes at the long table. But his mother said his name again, just his name the same way she had said it when he picked up, and it was the complete simplicity of it, the way a name spoken by the right voice can contain an entire history. And the tears came quietly on the warm marble steps in the Washington morning with his notebook in his lap. "You did good," Sandra said. "You did so good, baby." He pressed his hand against his face. He breathed. "I know, Mom," he said. "I know." In the 72 hours after the hearing, Page by Page's donation inbox received 14,000 requests, a number so far outside anything Caleb's server infrastructure was designed to handle that the website crashed twice and had to be taken offline for emergency upgrades. Dr. Reed's Howard colleagues in the computer science department volunteered the weekend to rebuild the intake system. Deshawn, who had been refreshing the website from Chicago every 20 minutes since the video went viral, sent Caleb a voice memo that was 40 seconds of him saying nothing comprehensible and everything necessary. 3 publishing houses that had not responded to Caleb's original letters, written at 13, logged in the composition notebook, alongside the rejections from the ones that had reached out with formal partnership offers. He read their emails, sitting in the hotel room in Washington before his flight back to Chicago, and he looked at the names of the houses and checked them against the list in his notebook, and there they were logged, dated, and marked as non-responses. He wrote "response received" next to each of them in pencil, and then he closed the notebook. A school principal in rural Mississippi who had been on Caleb's outreach list for 2 years and had not responded to 3 separate contact attempts called Dr. Reed's office on the Thursday after the hearing and said they were ready to receive books. Dr. Reed passed the message to Caleb with a single line of text: 2 years. He knew what she meant. Captain James Whitfield received a formal commendation from American Airlines at a private ceremony at O'Hare, attended by his wife, their son Eli, and a small group of colleagues. He had requested that the ceremony be kept small, that there be no press, and that the commendation be framed, if it was going to be framed at all, around the airline's commitment to passenger safety and dignity rather than around him personally. The airline agreed. Eli, who was 16 and had been watching his father's name circulate across the internet for a week, sat beside his mother at the small ceremony and said nothing and felt something that he did not yet have the words for but would spend years thinking about. Nora Haynes submitted her formal witness affidavit to the Pittsburgh District Attorney's Office on the Friday, following the hearing, 12 pages, single-spaced, organized chronologically and cross-referenced against the video timestamps, with the precision of someone who has spent a career understanding that the difference between justice and injustice is often the precision of the record. The DA's office deputy director later told a colleague privately that it was the most thorough witness statement he had received in 14 years. He was back in Englewood before the end of the week, back in the apartment on South Loomis Boulevard, where the hallway no longer had books in it, because the books had long since been distributed to places where they were needed, and the hallway was just a hallway. Now the same radiator clanging in the same wall. Sandra had made dinner, the specific dinner she made for significant occasions, the one that Caleb associated with birthdays, and the first day of school and the evening. The Tribune article ran when she had made it without telling him why, and he had understood why anyway. They ate without talking much because they had talked for a long time on the phone and had said the most important things already, and what remained was the comfortable nearness of being in the same room after a distance that had been greater than miles. After dinner, he went to see Deshawn. They sat on the front steps of Deshawn's building in the early evening, and the neighborhood moved around them in its ordinary way, kids on bikes, a car with the window down, someone's grandmother calling a name from an upper floor. They had been sitting on these steps since they were old enough to sit on steps alone. The folding table with the books had stood just down the block. Deshawn didn't ask him about the senators or the video or the viral reach of Owen Tran's 47 seconds. He asked him if he was okay, the real version of the question, the one that means not today but overall in general, underneath everything. Caleb thought about it genuinely before answering, which was how he knew the question had been asked correctly. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." They sat in the quiet of a neighborhood that had given Caleb everything he was and everything he was trying to do. The south side of Chicago, Englewood, South Loomis Boulevard, the elementary school with the library that had 212 books, the church basement where the better library had been built from donated lumber and a pastor's generosity, and a boy who had decided that the absence of something was not the same as the impossibility of it. He went home and sat at his desk. He opened the composition notebook. On the inside cover, the letter from the Vermont editor, the photograph of the Georgia third graders reading in a circle, the photograph of Sandra at the kitchen table with the Senate letter in front of her. And now, tucked carefully into the fold, the plain white card with Nora Haynes's name and phone number in neat, small handwriting. He taped the Senate hearing badge to the inside cover beside the photograph of his mother. Then he turned to the last blank page. He sat for a moment with the pen in his hand. The page was white and entirely open. He thought about everything that had happened since he had last sat with this notebook. The arc of the past 3 days. The plane and the slap and the captain and Pittsburgh, and the marble steps and his mother's voice saying his name. He wrote one sentence. He capped the pen. He closed the notebook. He left the desk lamp on and went to sleep. 6 weeks after Flight 417 landed in Pittsburgh, Diana Sloan entered a guilty plea in an Allegheny County courtroom, a proceeding that lasted less than an hour, attended by no press, and a nearly empty gallery concluded with a sentence of community service and a fine and the exit through a side door that no one was waiting outside of. There was no statement, no apology, no final performance. There was only the completion of a consequence that had begun the moment her hand crossed the distance between seat 4A and seat 4B, and the quiet, which was not comfortable but was accurate, of a person learning to live inside what they have done. The $400 million School Library Equity and Access Act passed the Senate Education Committee by unanimous vote 11 weeks after Caleb's testimony. The news reached him by text from Dr. Reed while he was in the church basement with Deshawn sorting a new shipment of books, 3,000 volumes from the 3 publishing house partnerships organized by age level in the particular system they had developed together over years, the shelves that Deshawn had built from donated lumber now reinforced and extended to accommodate the growth. Caleb read the text message twice. He set his phone face down on the edge of a shelf. He picked up the next book and kept sorting. Deshawn asked if he was okay. "Yeah," Caleb said. "More than." That night, alone at his desk on South Loomis Boulevard, Caleb opened the composition notebook to the last page, the page he had turned to 6 weeks ago in the quiet after everything and written one sentence on. He read the sentence. Then he turned to a fresh page after it and began to write. Not testimony, this time, not statistics, not the carefully structured argument designed to change the minds of senators who needed to be convinced, but something new, something that did not yet have a shape or a name, only a beginning, which was always where the most important things started. Because that was what the books had taught him before anything else, that every empty page is a question, and that the most courageous thing a person can do is decide to answer it even without knowing yet what the answer is, even when the hands are still slightly unsteady from everything that came before. He wrote until the lamp was the only light left in the building. He wrote the way you write when you know for the first time and with your whole body that the story you are telling belongs to you, not given, not borrowed, not rescued from a bottom shelf by accident, but yours entirely and without condition, the way a seat is yours when your name is on the boarding pass and no force in the world has the right to make you move. He wrote, and the page was no longer empty, and in the morning there would be more pages and more after that, and that was enough. That was everything. If this story moved you or made you think about someone you know who is building something extraordinary from nothing, share it. And if you believe that stories like Caleb's deserve to be heard by as many people as possible, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every story we bring you is built around moments that demand to be witnessed. We'll see you in the next one.